Good afternoon. I am Rachel Maves, Deputy Superintendent of the Instruction and Measurement Branch at the California Department of Education. On behalf of State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman, I would like to welcome you to this webinar focused on the role of high-quality instructional materials to support distance learning. As districts, schools, and families consider the ways teaching and learning will take place in the fall, we know that there are a variety of decisions that local educational agencies will have to make. As educators, we know that designing and delivering high-quality instruction remains a top priority. The California Department of Education is committed to supporting your efforts, and together we will consider the ways our approaches to standards-aligned resources can continue to meet the needs of each and every one of your students, regardless of the context for learning. We know that high-quality instructional materials are tools that can support high-quality instruction. We know that it is the teacher and their instructional practices that make lessons come to life and accessible by all students. It is with that framing that we present this webinar to you today. Joining me from the Instruction and Measurement Branch this afternoon is Shanine Coates, the Director of the Curriculum Frameworks and Instructional Resources Division here at the CDE, and representatives from Cal Curriculum, a partnership between Ed Reports and Pivot Learning. Together, we've designed a webinar for educators to reframe and engage in conversations around instructional materials for distance learning, and to provide strategies to support you in reviewing your current instructional materials and how they support high-quality instructional practices. For a more specific introduction to this process, I'll hand you over to Shanine.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome to today's webinar. We know that teachers, above all, understand the importance of appropriate resources to support their instruction. As the Deputy Superintendent mentioned, CDE is committed to supporting high-quality instruction that meets the needs of each and every student. The focus of today's webinar is to help you consider how your instructional materials are supporting the variety of scenarios: distance learning, hybrid, or in-person learning. We will give you a bit of background regarding the purpose of standards, frameworks, and instructional materials, and discuss why instructional materials matter, and provide you with the tools necessary to assess the quality of your instructional materials, including how they support your local context and educational needs. During the webinar, you will be able to enter questions you have in the Zoom Q&A window, and we will take time at the end of the webinar today to answer some of your questions. We will follow up with you afterwards if you have additional questions that we were unable to answer today. Your questions will also help us in the development of our frequently asked questions. And finally, we will be providing everyone who attended this webinar with the slides following the presentation. They will also be posted on our distance learning website shortly. As we discuss instructional materials today, it is important to be reminded that standards, curriculum frameworks, and instructional resources are three components of a process designed to ensure high quality and accessible instructional materials are used in day-to-day learning, whether that learning takes place in person or remotely. This slide illustrates the relationship between our division, the Instructional Quality Commission, and the State Board of Education as it pertains to the development and adoption of subject area standards and curriculum frameworks. When California local educational agencies previously selected and adopted their instructional materials, no one could have known we'd be confronting the COVID-19 pandemic. Further, it's likely no one considered how abruptly schools would need to shift to distance learning and how adopted instructional materials could be adapted to the new learning situation. Today, we'll consider how these resources, or how those that you are currently using in the distance learning environment, can support the learning model for the next school year. Here in support of planning for the next school year are our partners in presenting this webinar: Shanna Estep, Allison Carter, and Manny Barrera of Cal Curriculum. I'll let them explain a bit more about the ways Cal Curriculum supports educators. I'd like to provide an opportunity for each co-presenter to introduce themselves as we get started.
Good afternoon. I'm Shanna Estep. I am the Senior Outreach Specialist with Ed Reports. This is my 28th year in education, and I'm from California. I live in Fresno. I've been blessed with working with many of the school districts here in Fresno and at the Fresno County Office of Ed as well. I'll turn it over to Allison.
Great, very nice to speak with you all today. I'm Allison Carter. I'm Vice President of Education Programs at Pivot Learning, and I lead a portfolio of projects which includes all of Pivot's curriculum implementation work with school districts.
Thanks, Allison. I'm Manny Barrera. I'm the program manager at Pivot Learning focused on Cal curriculum. And before this, I worked in curriculum and instruction across districts and networks for about 10 years. So let's talk about Cal curriculum. Cal curriculum was founded as a partnership between Pivot, Ed Reports, and the CDE, which started about 4 years ago. Next slide. Ed Reports provides reports that help educators evaluate educational materials because high quality content matters to teachers, kids, and our collective future. Pivot Learning is an education nonprofit with a 25-year history based in California. We collaborate with districts to improve teaching and learning through the adoption and implementation of high quality materials. And Cal curriculum as a whole offers independent reviews, tools, resources, and guidance on instructional materials, adoption, and implementation. So now that we've all introduced ourselves and our organizations, we'd like to get to know you a little bit more. Shanine is going to share a poll with us.
Thank you, Manny. So we'd now like to take a moment to see who is with us today. So if you're joining us via Zoom, please respond to the poll by selecting the role which best describes your work. We will open the poll and give you about 30 seconds to respond. Few more moments. Great. Great. I see here that we have a wide range of roles represented, all in various roles that are supporting instruction, which is actually very perfect for today, because today is about considering where you are as professional educators, the factors that have led you to this place, and how to move forward. As you saw in the responses to the participant poll, we have educators from various aspects of the field, and we look forward to the ways these backgrounds can inform our understanding of the current context of teaching and learning, considerations for and approaches to selecting instructional materials for your context, and identifying guidance and support that can serve as the foundation for your efforts to plan for the coming school year. So let's talk about distance learning. Distance learning refers to instruction in which the student and the instructor are in different locations. Next slide, please. This slide, next slide, please, illustrates the various ways students and teachers connect with one another and the ways instructional resources influence those interactions. Distance learning is tailored to the context in which it's used. In some areas of California, the use of print materials is part of the instructional process. Teachers may be creating and disseminating packets for students or collecting work and providing feedback, while also providing other students with computer communications through email classroom platforms. As we move through the presentation, we're going to consider how these elements might comprise the distance learning efforts of your district or site. At this time, we'd like to provide you with a moment to reflect on your work this spring. Consider how your instructional practices were disrupted, excuse me, and what kinds of adaptations did you or would you make in order to continue striving to provide high quality instruction. If you have a sticky note or are writing notes on a piece of paper, I encourage you to take this time to just jot down some thoughts as we continue to move through the presentation. Educators at all levels have shared the challenges they face related to acquiring and accessing materials to support distance learning. Many have noted that they're actually swimming in resources and that they require consistent and coherent guidance that outlines what resources to use, how to use them, and why. The what in this instance refers to the instructional materials teachers should be using. The how and why provide guidance on what instructional practices are best suited for distance learning. State-adopted standards and curriculum frameworks provide such guidance. The California standards for the teaching profession can also be used as a reflective tool to help educators assess what materials to use and how to appropriately use them with students. We know teachers are intrepid creative professionals, and we know they have always searched for and selected resources to support their instruction. COVID-19 again showed teachers striving to reach their students. Even though distance learning takes a different form than traditional classroom settings, the fundamental elements supporting earnest, effective instruction are the same whether delivered in person or remotely. For example, your previous classroom instruction might have included a variety of modifications like scaffolds, language support, or accessibility features like large print or audio. Distance learning plans should also include tools, resources, and appropriate modifications to support all students. If it's a best practice for teaching and learning, we can likely translate it to a best practice for distance learning. The flexibility used in brick and mortar settings to accommodate the learning needs of all students should be an indelible feature of any distance learning plan as we continue to ensure best practices. I'd like to take a moment to further ground our work and show the connections in our work that support learning. Standards come about as a result of legislation. Once standards are approved by the State Board of Education, our division works with educators to draft frameworks, and these frameworks serve as guidance documents. They are used by publishers and include the criteria for instructional materials. So it's all connected. High quality instruction is grounded in and aligned with the standards. The standards are essentially the what for students and teachers, and they provide the language of student expectations for each grade or proficiency level, as well as where we want students to be at the end of the school career. Content standards are designed to encourage the highest achievement of every student by defining the knowledge, the concepts, and the skills that students should acquire at each grade level. In California, the State Board of Education adopts standards for all students from kindergarten through high school. Once we know the what, the standards, a framework represents the how. It is guidance regarding the implementation of the standards for teachers, school administrators, and decision makers, and publishers of instructional materials. It is based on the most recent and confirmed research. However, at the same time that we discuss what a framework is and does, it's also important to clarify what a framework is not. A framework is not a state mandate. It's not a scope and sequence or a curriculum. And a framework does not replace ongoing professional learning. A framework includes chapters by grade level or grade spans, and chapters on assessment, instructional strategies, and professional development. Frameworks describe how to design rich and rigorous curricula and illustrate powerful teaching and learning. It does that in part through snapshots and vignettes, which provide glimpses and exemplary models of instruction. These are often helpful for professional learning. All State Board of Education frameworks were drafted before we faced the reality of distance learning in response to the COVID pandemic. If you refer, though, to any of these documents, you likely won't find specific guidance that specifies a distance learning environment. But that said, the comprehensive research-based guidance, whether through universal access or an access and equity chapter, or in the snapshots and in vignettes in grade level chapters, can still support educators who are now faced with integrating distance learning needs into their teaching plans. The CDE recommends that any and all supplemental materials used in distance learning reflect the guidance of the framework and alignment with the standards. The guidance in the framework still applies to instruction in distance learning environments. The ELA-ELD framework, for example, is built on guiding principles outlined on this slide. As you read these, make connections between these principles and the way you envision your instruction in the next school year. How can these principles continue to support professional learning for high-quality instruction. The framework notes that schooling should help all students achieve their highest potential. English language arts, literacy, and English language development curricula should be well-designed, comprehensive, and integrated, even at a distance. The last two principles resonate powerfully with some of the persistent dilemmas educators are facing at this time. Similarly, the guiding principles in the mathematics framework still apply. Mathematics instruction should be focused, coherent, and rigorous, create enjoyment, and foster critical thinking, be based on the standards, utilize technology, and include an assessment for and of learning. We now come to the tools that teachers and students use to progress toward the goal of standards mastery and what we're here to talk about today, the instructional materials or instructional resources. We will talk about this for the remainder of the presentation. This next slide really is just for your reference, and it provides background on the State Board of Education instructional materials adoption. There's more detailed information about this on our website if you're interested. The State Board of Education adoption process includes 3 focus areas. Materials are reviewed by current classroom teachers and content experts to ensure they cover 100% of the grade level content standards in full. This is always the first criterion in Category 1, subject area, content, and alignment with standards. In addition, all of the other criteria in this category must be met. There are 4 other categories of criteria where the program must demonstrate strengths. They are program organization, assessment, equity, and instructional planning and teacher support. Finally, programs are reviewed to ensure they do not violate any of the laws addressing inappropriate content for classrooms. The purpose of this review is to provide districts with options. It is important to note that the state-level process does not include some qualitative areas, such as judgments on instructional pedagogy, as the local districts will want to choose those programs, including those that have greater strengths in a particular area, that are most suited to meet the needs of their local student populations. The State Board of Education has adopted guidelines to assist districts with their own review, piloting, and adoption of materials, available at the link on this slide. In accordance with those guidelines, let us now transition into an examination of how we might conceive of and utilize instructional materials in this potentially new environment. I will now turn it over to Shanna to further discuss high-quality instructional materials for a variety of scenarios. Shanna?
Thank you, Shanine. We'll go ahead and, there we go. I am really excited to be here with you today, and excited to have this discussion. We have a lot of participants on today, so hopefully we'll have an opportunity to answer some of the questions that are coming up. But I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. In 2012, this is a report from the Brookings Institute, where researchers found that there are a myriad of factors that influence classroom instruction, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the instructional core, which is the triangle you see there in the center. And materials have a huge impact on both instructional decisions and students' interactions with teachers and the content. And this interaction actually is critical when students aren't with us. It's important when they are with us, but when they're not with us and they're in their homes or somewhere else, these interactions are really important, and we're discovering that instructional materials actually are influencing those decisions quite often. Next slide. But before we move on, we're actually going to give you an opportunity to reflect on and consider your particular experience with instructional materials in the move to distance learning. We're going to share 4 district vignettes. These vignettes were developed from a recent set of interviews we've done with educators who are representing a variety of roles in school systems. And we asked them about their move from in-person to distance learning. And we've grouped their responses based on some themes we're seeing. So District A, so the first set of the themes that arose. District A, we had materials, but I couldn't say if they were high quality or not, nor could I say if they were being used. Most teachers were pulling from a variety of resources, vetted and unvetted, for their daily instruction. So that's one set of themes that came out of these interviews. District B, we had high quality instructional materials in place prior to schools closing. However, my teachers hadn't been fully trained on the use of all online components of the materials, and that didn't translate well to distance learning. Additionally, not all essential materials were available online, which led to lots of teachers trying to find supplements. District C, we had high quality, well-aligned instructional materials with digital enhancements in place before school interruption. However, schools struggled with the implementation in a distant setting since many students couldn't access the digital elements of the materials, and the online modules didn't match with the traditional materials which required a lot of planning, excuse me, and preparation. And then finally, we were implementing high quality instructional materials prior to schools closing. Teachers had solid training and support to implement the materials in their instruction pre-school closure. So we worked on ways for teachers to continue to collaborate and plan more effectively, and focused on being creative with the time we had with students. So we're curious, which of these district vignettes or stories most closely aligns to what you all experienced? So we'll take a minute to take a quick poll. Okay. Interesting. Great, we'll give folks a chance to see the poll results. Okay. We'll go ahead and advance the next slide, please. While we're doing that, thank you for that. The results were very interesting. I think highlights the fact that whether we're in person or in a distance learning environment, the tenets of good teaching and learning still hold true. So we need to ask ourselves a couple of questions as we're thinking about what the role of instructional materials was and will be when we get ready to plan for the fall, and the basics that are grounded in a strong instructional vision of instruction for literacy, math, science, whatever the content area is. And then how does that vision of instruction translate then to a distance learning environment? How do those materials support that vision? And then a secondary question when we have kids who aren't with us in the building are the capabilities and capacities of the materials in your system then to help you reach that vision. And finally, what the guidance is for teachers and families that is in place to help ensure that systematic, coherent instruction in a distance learning environment. So let me talk just for a moment about the importance of instructional materials. We have, I'll share with you in a follow-up email some of our research that we have on this topic. We'll just talk about a couple of these in the webinar today. But instructional materials are a very important lever to help you reach that vision, that North Star, if you will. And strong, well-aligned materials actually can mitigate a variety of challenges that we experience both in person and when we're in a distance learning environment. Here are two challenges that we see most often. Number one is that teachers and schools are overwhelmed by choices. The options available to districts have always been varied in quality, and lately even more so with schools closing and teachers being inundated with resources to support. And those resources haven't necessarily been vetted to be, or have been shown to be high quality. Two of the studies I'm showing here, the one with the bar graph, that's from TNTP's Opportunity Myth, and the bottom pie chart, which is a report from Fordham called the Curriculum Bazaar. Both of these are about the quality of lessons that we're finding when we're searching online. This message on the quote on the left is from a very recent blog from the Brookings Institute, focused on how teachers and districts made the shift to distance learning. And again, teachers being swimming in resources, if you will, but really struggling with the quality of those resources. Next slide. Here's just a zoom in on a challenge that we're all facing here in California and honestly nationally, is the impact on equity and access to the standards. So in TNTP's The Opportunity Myth, which will make available to you to read if you haven't read that already, but it was a recent report where they looked at the assignments that students were given, and they found that on average, students are spending 3/4 of their instructional time in off-grade level work, and that directly impacts our students who are most traditionally underserved. So we have challenges of a lot of materials, but not knowing the quality of those materials, and the lack of quality then impacting our students who are most traditionally underserved. And strong, well-aligned instructional materials can help us mitigate both of those challenges. Next slide. I think this quote here, fundamentally, having high quality curriculum as a baseline made everything easier. Our teams are having enough of a challenge translating their lessons to distance learning formats. If they were still creating the lesson content each week, we can't fathom how much harder this would be. Really kind of sums up some of the experiences having moved very quickly to an online environment. We know that materials alone are not the solution. We also know that the materials don't just exist in isolation. We have to consider how our communities are accessing the materials, as well as the systems and support in place to support teachers and instruction with those materials. Ed Reports, we recently launched a brand new tool to help districts reflect on their experiences from the spring and also prepare for the fall, where we delve into the quality of materials, the systems that were in place, and the community access so that we can guarantee that all students are accessing grade level instruction. Next slide. First, some key things that we need to think about in assessing the quality of the materials has to do, quality as we define it, is aligned to the standards and instructional shifts. They support students who are learning English or who are multilingual learners, students who on IEPs, and also supports for students and teachers for additional instruction. Making sure that there are tools and accessibility for distance learning, whether those are in a digital format or some kind of analog format. I think the key question is, how are we ensuring that all of our students have access to these materials? One way to use or to assess the quality is to use calcurriculum.org. Our website currently features reviews for K-12 ELA math and for 6-8 science materials. And here's a screenshot of the website itself. You can go to reports and read either a high level information. So what you see here are 2 literacy ELA programs, and you'll get an overview with a dot, if you will. A green dot, which means meets expectations. A yellow dot means it partially meets expectations. And a red dot means it did not meet expectations. And then you can actually click for a report breakdown so you can see more closely exactly what that means. When you're on the CalCurriculum website, not only will you see the resources and reports, but we have additional tools and guidance for implementation and adoption of materials. Moving along. In addition to considering the quality of the materials you're using, in our tool, we ask questions that are focused around the system landscape, making sure that there is a clear vision of instruction and aspirations for teaching and learning have been shared with both teachers, parents, students. What are the tech supports and capacities of your materials? What professional learning has been done or is there for teachers and school leaders? And then also, how are we thinking about the students' experience during remote learning, whether those students need additional supports, are on IEPs, learning English, etc. And finally, we can't leave out our communities. I know lots of my own friends who are struggling with the shift, who were saying they had everything in place, but their communities had trouble accessing. So they had trouble accessing both the materials themselves and or devices or the internet. We also have to make sure that we're in regular communication with teachers in schools. I'm a parent with 3 kids. I was fortunate. I had lots of communication from both the school district and classroom teachers, but that wasn't always the case for lots of our kids. So thinking about how do we regularly communicate with teachers and schools and parents, and then supports for parents and caregivers in accessing the materials. I think, as everyone is thinking about the move to distance learning or hybrid situation, which many school districts might be in the fall, assessing how the materials, and if you can advance the slide, please. Assessing how the materials are assisting you to meet that vision is one element, but I think materials are relatively low-hanging fruit, something that we can grasp relatively quickly and easily when we're thinking about standards implementation and the instructional shifts implementation for our students in the fall. The next step then would be to make sure you have a solid plan for assessing student readiness. And so I'll pass that to Manny.
Thanks, Shanna. So now that we've discussed the importance of quality materials in all environments, including distance learning, let's plan for how to use those materials in a variety of scenarios that districts will be facing in the next school year. We know that some districts will be completely in person with modifications. Some districts will have a hybrid model utilizing both in-person and distance learning, and some districts will be fully remote. Regardless of the scenario, districts will need to plan to ensure that all students are receiving high-quality teaching and learning. That includes learning about where you ended up in the spring with ELA and math instruction, what you are doing in the summer with professional learning with educators, as well as planning for material implementation for the 2021 school year. In regards to learning from your ELA and math data, here's an example of a set of surveys that school districts and charters can use to better understand stakeholder experience of ELA and math instruction in the spring. You can access the Equitable Learning Recovery Toolkit by going to this link to learn more. After you've gathered your stakeholder data, districts should focus on their plan for summer professional learning. It's especially important you do this before the next school year starts to prepare your educators for what's going to be a very different school year. This includes how educators will be addressing unmet needs, which will likely have increased from the year before. It also includes preparing educators for effectively leveraging their instructional materials in whatever scenario, whether it be completely distant learning, in-person, or hybrid. And as we all know, families have taken a larger role in educating their children in this new COVID reality. And they will need to be more engaged in instruction, especially in scenarios that are completely utilizing distance learning or hybrid environments. As we've suggested, to better understand your current context, it'll be important for you to talk to different stakeholders about their experiences. Here are some example questions to help guide your planning for summer professional learning. For example, For students, it'll be important to ask about their unfinished learning and what materials and instruction may be helpful for them. For school-based staff, it will be important that you clearly communicate the expectations for distance learning and provide them with professional learning to address the unfinished instruction. For parents and guardians, it'll be important to clearly communicate expectations and what resources they will need to better support their children. And now Allison will go over how to plan for the next school year.
I think Allison may be muted.
I'm sorry, guys. I've been talking to myself. Thank you, Manny. As you consider how to start the 2021 school year, you should, of course, go to CDE for guidance. They have a lot of resources there. You can go to their website, which cover everything that you would need to be considering as a district and school leader. For right now, though, we are going to focus just on what you'll need to do around teaching and learning for the 2021 school year. Specifically, similar to what we've discussed, school districts should focus on understanding where their students are in their unfinished learning. You will also need to focus on student access to high-quality materials and instruction, and you will need to focus on how you will continue to provide professional learning opportunities for teachers and other site-based staff around materials and instruction. This professional learning will include synchronous and asynchronous and likely virtual PD opportunities. It would also include, of course, at-site and in-classroom support. Depending on health safety protocols, you may need to consider how best to understand the quality of material implementation and instruction in classrooms in different ways, including leveraging technology. Last, similar to what we have said about the summer, we will need to continue to engage families in supporting students, especially in distance and hybrid scenarios. Specifically around addressing unfinished instruction, districts should focus on accelerated recovery and not on remediation. Districts should focus specifically on priority students, especially students who have the largest gaps in learning. Assessments or screeners that assess unfinished learning should be selected carefully. They should be valid and reliable, and the district should have the capacity to administer these assessments virtually and across their entire district system. Districts will need to adopt high-quality instructional materials if they haven't done so already. And if you have adopted high-quality materials, you should focus on implementation of those ELA and math materials. Many of us know that even before COVID, the education system struggled to center equity and ensure access of high-quality materials and instruction for our highest need students. Especially in this time, we must ensure that we center equity in our planning, continuously gathering data on access to and quality of technology and materials and instruction for priority students, and take action immediately. This iterative monitoring of access to and quality of technology, materials, and instruction should be a big part of district plans and ongoing processes. As a part of this, it will be essential for districts to reframe their instructional vision for both ELA and math to account for all scenarios, remote, hybrid, and modified in person. Districts will need to think about what good teaching and learning looks like, even if not always done in a traditional physical classroom. In addition to reframing the instructional vision, districts will also need to be very clearly communicating what these changes will mean to teachers and site-based staff to ensure equitable instruction in all environments. Now more than ever, it's essential that students have access to high-quality materials and aligned instruction. If a district has not adopted and implemented materials, it will be important that the district does so quickly. If districts have adopted and implemented high-quality materials, it will be important that the district assesses the implementation, of those materials, including the alignment of instruction to the materials and student access. Again, in order to ensure that educators have the capacity to implement high-quality materials in the various scenarios, it will be essential that districts build a system for asynchronous and synchronous and likely virtual professional learning and ongoing support. As we've discussed, parents and guardians have taken a bigger role in at-home learning of their children. In the next school year, the increased role of parents and guardians in learning will likely continue. Given that, parents and guardians will need a roadmap and a set of expectations around their role in the various scenarios. It will also be important that school districts provide parents and guardians with learning opportunities around instructional materials as well. Given all of this, it will be important that districts build robust plans for the 2021 school year. These plans need to be based in data and centered on equity. Plans need to include everything from material adoption and implementation planning to pacing and a revised assessment calendar that leverages valid and reliable assessments and allows for flexibility, keeping the various scenarios the districts may face in mind. In addition to overall teaching and learning plan for the 2021 school year, you should also develop an aligned, strong communications plan that includes initial feedback from all of your stakeholder groups, a set of strategies and messages that are disseminated widely, and a process for ongoing engagement and feedback. Beyond the overall plan and aligned communications plan, you should also be developing an aligned evaluation plan that accounts for regular data collection, analysis, and action. And you should have a professional learning calendar that includes the synchronous and asynchronous professional development and ongoing support for teachers and site staff. As we all know, there is still a lot of uncertainty going into 2021, and we don't know what exactly will happen. Regardless, it will be essential that districts first focus on centering equity and access, especially for priority students, including English learners, at-promise students, and students with disabilities. Districts will need to continue to plan and collect data and make modifications to their plans quickly. They will need to continue to focus on clear and regular communications, and they will need to continue to strengthen their capacity for virtual teaching and learning. That concludes the content portion of our presentation. Thank you for listening.
We thank you for joining us today. Take care and be well.